The talk I'm going to be sharing with you is what I call 30 years of learning from children with autism spectrum disorders and their family. It actually goes back to closer to 40 years, believe it or not. I started working in summer camps with kids, and you're actually going to see a little evidence of that shortly. Way back when, in the late 1960s. At that time, I was working 24/7. 7 years I worked in residential summer camps in Pennsylvania and New York State. Living with kids and adults with disabilities. Many of them, upon reflection, probably would have had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. They might have had. I didn't know what autism was at that time. And then I went on in my career focusing on autism from my master's thesis, my doctoral dissertation in the 70s, and then just jumping around to a few university graduate programs where we developed specialty tracks in autism. And now I'm in private practice. I should mention I saw the medical model side a little bit. I ran a department in a Brown University Children's Psychiatric Hospital for a few years, for about 8 years. And now I'm back mostly spending time with kids and families. Just to let you know, I consult to about 12 or 14 school districts in the Northeast when I'm not giving talks on the CERTS model or other talks. And on reflection, really most of what I've learned has been from children and families. The literature changes constantly. What was gospel in the 70s and 80s is now considered inaccurate now. Probably a lot of information we have now will be considered, well, maybe a good theory, but inaccurate 10 years from now. But what remains constant are the families and the children and what they could teach us about how we could be better professionals for those of you who are professionals. And if you're parents, understand that your role is a lot more than supporting your child's development. Your role is helping professionals to be better at what they do by joining and collaborating with them. So, I'm going to fly through some information. I always put up too many slides, as most speakers do. First, we're going to begin with lessons I've learned about supporting children with ASD and their families directly. This information is in your conference packet, and all the lessons are laid out with some implications. I want to introduce you to some of my first teachers, and I don't know if it's possible. I'd asked if the lights could be down over the screen a little bit. They're washing out the screens a little bit, because I do have a lot of photos. That would be great. Thank you. This is literally circa 1970. These are from the ancient archives of Buffalo, New York. These were 4 children that I first worked with who I knew had a diagnosis of autism. I was just finishing my master's degree in speech and language pathology. This was at Buffalo Children's Hospital. And I remember these kids like it was yesterday. I mean, I really, really remember David. David taught me about the incredible discrepancy in abilities we see sometimes. I mean, David had just an unbelievable memory. David was this what we call a very high arousal, spirited little guy who moved a hell of a lot faster than I did, and that wasn't so good in some cases. Robbie was a child with significant sensory issues, and at that time, we didn't talk about sensory issues. He was tactily defensive, especially around his head. You know kids who are tactily defensive around their head? Yeah. Haircuts, you know, and Robbie had this, it's hard to see, but Robbie had this incredible, beautiful black mane of curly hair. Now, when you see a very adorable 5-year-old child with that hair, what do you do as an adult? You try to put your hand in it, which for Robbie was not a pleasant experience. Jeff taught me that even though the literature, especially back then at that time, was talking about kids with autism don't have emotions or experience emotions. Remember, we were still in the shadow of the psychoanalytic days in the early 70s. Bettelheim's book had just come out in '67 saying that cold parents, refrigerator mothers caused autism. That wasn't the predominant theory anymore, because Bernie Rimland's book had been out since '64 saying, no, we're talking about a biologically based disability. But we are still talking about the fact that these kids, oh, emotions, forget it. It's something that's so far off the radar screen for them. And I remember one day during the rest time where one of my jobs was in the playroom to put the kids down on little rugs so that they could relax and have their relaxation time. 3 of the kids were incredibly high arousal kids, which was not an easy thing to do. But I remember, as we all are human, one point I took Jeff, who was running circles around the room, and I said, Jeff, you need to sit down. And he looked at me, started crying, and went, Barry mad? Okay, and this was a child in the autism spectrum, all right? Which was a big lesson for me. And then finally, all I could say about Brian is, it's really problematic when you work with a kid who's far smarter than you are. And what I tried to do with Brian was what I've learned over the years is not a good thing to do. I always tried to get him to conform to my agenda. He did not want to have much to do with me. He had a lot of interests, a lot of intense interests, but it was always about Barry, new green speech and language pathologist, here's my lesson plan. And Brian basically said through his language and his behavior, sorry, Barry, I got my own things to do. Okay, this is my first intensive introduction. By the way, I followed these children for a full year eventually. They were all echolalic as part of their language, different stages of echolalia. I followed them for a year through videotape analysis in the old primitive days. That was my doctoral dissertation, because the literature at this time was telling us echolalia is psychotic speech, meaningless parroting, and it needs to be punished. And these kids were communicating to me and with their parents every day through their echolalia. And we were able to prove that echolalia is functional much of the time and part of a child's language development, which flew in the face of the prevailing attitude at this time. Okay, oh, there I am again. This is summer camp. This is a very interesting camp in Pennsylvania, a residential summer camp. It was supposedly a camp for kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, and at least 4 of these boys were on the autism spectrum. Probably my memory was 2 of them were more able verbal kids with autism, and 2 of the kids had Asperger's. That was quite an experience and quite a mix when you have some kids with like street smarts, brought up in very stressful, demanding environments, and then you have other kids whose disability is that of social understanding. And then you run into the problems of the pecking order and the hierarchy and who manipulates whom in those circumstances. But it was a great learning experience. This was about a year after I went to Woodstock. Can you kind of get the feel of that? Okay. So we're going to dance through a lot of the lessons that I've learned, and hopefully they'll be of some value to you and it'll ring some bells for you. First of all, we believe strongly, and I've learned, that an understanding of human development and individual differences in development is essential in supporting children with ASD. In our model, the CERTS model, we come from a developmental perspective, and we say understanding child and human development has everything to do with good education and good treatment for kids with autism. It's not just a matter of being well trained in techniques on how to modify or change behavior. We have to put that within the context of what is age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate for young children. So let's talk about some of these facts. First of all, human development is far more than the accumulation of skills, okay? No less than Albert Einstein once said, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted, okay? So what counts that can't be counted or is difficult to count, even though we've tried to do some of this in the CERTS model? Such things as relationships, such things as community, such things as informal supports to families, by neighbors, by friends, by relatives. All of these issues have a tremendous impact and trickle down to a child's development. Certainly we have to work on skills that are functional, but sometimes if we focus too much just on training skills in young kids, we miss the bigger pieces. For example, I feel very strongly that unless we get children into situations in which they are around other children on a regular basis, it inhibits the development of relationships and being able to learn from other children. It's absolutely essential, and this is empirically supported now. National Academy of Sciences, after a review of literature on autism, says all children with autism need to have, quote, social instruction with peers in various settings. Yet we still hear people saying, well, it just needs to be one-to-one. That limits a child's possibilities. Now, granted, it's going to be much more challenging for young kids with autism, being in a little circle time of bringing in another group of kids, but now the empirical research, as well as our knowledge of child development, supports the importance of that. Another issue is having to do with how do we even consider intelligence, human intelligence. There's some wonderful work that I'm just going to touch upon briefly that's been around for decades, the work of Howard Gardner and his theory of multiple intelligences. Basically what Gardner says is that human beings, their intelligence cannot be reduced down to how much language they have or how many questions they answer, verbal or mathematical, logical intelligence. We have to understand that kids with ASD have a very uneven profile of abilities. Excuse me. You see it, you live it. And we have to understand what children with ASD are very good at and what they're very challenged by. So another very important aspect of human development, and that is we are multidimensional. As a matter of fact, there's been a new one that's been added recently to the 7 multiple intelligences, and that is what some people are referring to as spiritual intelligence. Okay? It's very interesting. All right. As a matter of fact, just to illustrate this point, this is a definition of autism that some typical kids in a second grade class gave after they got to know their friend Christopher, who was in the class. And they said, autism means that someone is really smart in some things but needs a lot of help in other things. These are second graders, okay? And that's what we want to see. We know many of our kids are challenged, but we want the world and other children to see the strengths as well.